An epic question is going to be answered today. Do you need to carefully plan your diet if you're not eating meat or dairy and you're exclusively vegan? We're going to find out with Dr. Matthew Nagra right here on the exam room. Time to sit under the learning tree, my friends. Welcome to the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hello, I'm Chuck Carroll. Thank you so very much for watching and downloading in more than 150 countries around the world and making the Exam Room one of the most consumed nutrition podcasts anywhere on the planet today. And critics of a plant-based diet often say that if you're going to eat a vegan diet and it's going to be ideal, you need to carefully plan everything that is going on your plate. It is one of the most difficult diets in the world to actually eat properly. But is that actually true? Well, our guest today has done a deep dive into this with a brand new paper. With that, we welcome our good friend back to the show for the first time in a long time, the one, the only Dr. Matthew Nagra. Thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me. And I have to say that whole intro, it seems new. Hey, it's a really cool intro.
We're trying to spruce things up a little bit. We're trying to kick things up a notch. Every show we've raised our health IQ. I'd like to raise the production value here and there as well. Thank you, my friend. So this criticism, obviously this is something that you've heard a lot as well, that it's really difficult to eat a plant-based diet and get all the nutrients that you possibly need. So you decided to do this paper. Did you, and we should say Dr. David Goldman also co-authored this with you. Was it just because you two were really tired of hearing this criticism and you wanted to do a dive into the data?
Yeah, I have to certainly give credit to David. It was his idea, and he brought it to me and said, "Hey, do you want to collaborate on this?" And absolutely. And the way that he sort of works, and I do to a degree, is when you are faced with a certain question or argument over and over and over again, rather than just trying to address it individually every single time, it's nice to be able to be like, "Oh, hey, I actually wrote about that here. Read this." And so that's really where it came from, so that we now have a resource that we can just share with people if they keep bringing up that sort of argument or question.
So what did you guys learn? What does the data show in terms of getting all the nutrients that you need in a plant-based diet? Is it next to impossible without that super careful planning?
No, it's certainly not next to impossible. There are certain nutrients that we need to take care for. So, for example, vitamin B12, that's the one that everybody at this point seems to know, or at least most people. And then there are certain other nutrients that require some care. Calcium, potentially, especially if you aren't consuming fortified plant-based milks. Vitamin D, perhaps, depending on where you live. I'm here in Vancouver, and we don't get a lot of strong sunlight. So vitamin D is something that I will take. But I think where we have a bigger issue is that careful planning caveat is only applied to plant-based diets, or often only applied to plant-based diets. The fact of the matter is, when you look at the research on different dietary patterns, we find that while, okay, vegans tend to get less of these few nutrients, they also tend to get more fiber, polyunsaturated fats, a number of B vitamins like vitamin B1 and B6, vitamin C, of course, and a few other nutrients. Whereas if you flip and look at meat eaters, they tend to get inadequate amounts of fiber, of polyunsaturated fats. They also tend to get limited amounts of vitamin D and calcium, and they're falling short on folate and other nutrients. So it just sort of flips as far as which nutrients you need to think about or be careful of, rather than just blaming a vegan diet per se because of those few nutrients I mentioned earlier.
Why do you think that caveat is almost exclusively put on a vegan diet, that careful consideration thing? Because, spoiler alert, I knew coming into the show that there are nutrient deficiencies that are rife in virtually every diet out there because nobody carefully plans, unless you're in that 0.001% of the entire population. Nobody carefully plans their diet. Why do you think it was so much more applied to that plant-based diet than the standard diet?
I think some of it is just a bias in that we are used to consuming, or humans, I should say in general, maybe not us because we're plant-based, but in general, the population is used to consuming certain foods and not really thinking about their nutrition. Now, when you go on a more what they would view as restrictive diet that is maybe different from the norm, there's this thought process that, oh, it must be really hard. We must have to think about things. And then, of course, you'll hear stories of somebody running into some kind of deficiency, which, again, as you pointed out, happens on every diet. But when it comes with a plant-based diet, that is what the headlines read. If somebody is consuming a super restrictive, like raw food diet, and they end up with some kind of health condition on the news, it doesn't specify that, hey, they weren't supplementing, they were on a raw food diet, etc. It's like, no, they were on a vegan diet and that led to their problems. So there are potentially some biases there that lead to that sort of conclusion.
And I will tell you from a former journalist standpoint that it's really hard for somebody who is not schooled or educated much in nutrition to properly write that article. And so they're going to write it in terms that they're familiar with, and they're not going to understand the nuances that you are talking about in this paper. Did anything, when you were diving into the research, did anything stand out and surprise you at all?
I wouldn't say there were a ton of surprises because, as I mentioned, this is something that I've been asked about a million times. I've responded to a million times. But something that I think is really worth noting and just never factors into the whole careful planning discussion is the health outcome data. So there's often talk about, oh, well, you have to carefully plan because of, again, vitamin B12 or certain nutrients. But what if we look at the long-term health outcomes? We see that vegans tend to have lower risks of cardiovascular diseases, lower risk of total cancer incidents, really good long-term health outcomes, whereas meat eaters, especially those who are eating fair amounts of like red meat or processed meats, they tend to have higher risks of those conditions, higher risks of other health issues. And actually, if I was to point to something that is maybe a little bit surprising in some ways, is if you look at vegans in the general population and you look at diet quality scores. So these are scores based around consumption of generally healthy whole plant foods, maybe certain healthier processed foods like whole grain products and so on. You see that actually vegans have higher diet quality than the meat eaters. And this sort of goes against the idea that, vegans are eating a lot of junk. They aren't necessarily informed on what they should be eating. They need to like super rigorously plan their diets. It's like, no, in the general population, vegans actually tend to have a pretty good diet quality, better than the meat eating counterparts. But that's just something that doesn't get talked about.
And that diet quality index that you're talking about there, that was created by an independent group, right? That's not something that was concocted by us here in the plant-based world. That is just generalized nutrition, correct?
Well, there are different types of diet quality scores. So I wouldn't say that there's one specifically, but if we're talking about, say, the Healthy Eating Index, which is one common one, that is actually just based on the American Dietary Guidelines, which is not a vegan guideline. They include animal products in there to varying degrees and maybe certain types. But it's not some like pro-vegan diet quality score that we're using here.
And let me ask you, I mean, you are someone who just absorbs this data. I mean, you dive into it, you live it, you breathe it. It's like you are Dr. Data, in my opinion. Like you love these research papers. Knowing what you do, how much time do you actually plan carefully crafting out what it is you're going to eat on a day-to-day basis?
Basically none now. I would say when I was learning more and as I found out about benefits of certain types of foods, I try to implement them a little bit more. So going back years now to when I'm learning about the cognitive benefits of like dark berries, especially blueberries. Maybe there was more intention of having some per day. I ate fruit every day anyway, but what if I specifically want to put berries in my oatmeal for those benefits or into my smoothies? These are things that maybe at a point that I would have thought about, but now it's just second nature. And I think that's something that's also important to note here is that there could be potentially a little bit of a learning curve when someone first goes plant-based. But over the course of the first few months or so, you sort of figure out what do you like as far as recipes. What are certain things that maybe I should be implementing if you are following people who are posting nutrition content like myself. Maybe you've learned that, hey, these polyunsaturated fats, these omega-3s from flax seeds are really good for us. Potentially, again, berries, as I mentioned, whole grains, oats, etc. You sort of learn what are the healthy foods to try to incorporate daily. And it doesn't have to be an everyday thing either. If you miss a day here or there, it's not a big deal. What we care about more so is the long-term consumption, the day-to-day.
Let me ask you this. Generally speaking, the advice that a lot of us are given is just eat the rainbow. Fill up your plate with as many colors from these natural whole foods as possible. And by and large, everything then should kind of take care of itself. Again, knowing what you do now, is that still like good, easy to follow advice?
It's reasonable because the different colors are often due to different specific nutrients or compounds in the foods, and having some diversity there is a good thing. But I wouldn't say that, hey, you do that, you're automatically taken care of. B12 aside, because that's an easy one to pick on here, let's look at calcium. Yes, you can get calcium through like leafy green vegetables, through certain nuts. It's difficult to actually hit the nutrient target for calcium through solely whole foods. It's possible, but it takes quite a bit of effort. What I suggest people do is have some calcium fortified plant-based milk in their day. A couple cups gets you half or over half of the way there for your day, and the rest through your food you probably don't have to think about. So there are certain nutrients where, again, having some fortified foods or trying to incorporate a specific food or two could be beneficial. It's just not something that takes an incredible amount of planning.
This research that you did, it also looked at, speaking of calcium, that brings fractures into the conversation. What did your research find in terms of a person's risk of sustaining a fracture depending upon their diet type?
Yeah, so there is some research linking plant-based diets to higher fracture risk, but we looked at broadly the overall balance of data because there's quite a few studies on this now, and we found conflicting results either way. In some cases, potentially protective or no risk, and in other cases, a higher risk. We also see that higher plant-based diet quality, so not even exclusively plant-based, but just eating more whole or minimally processed plants in general, tended to be associated with lower risks of fractures. And when you dive into the research on vegan diets and fracture that actually link it to a higher risk, it seems to be driven largely by the fact that vegans weigh less. And so if you actually increase your body weight, you increase your bone mineral density because you're carrying more weight. And so you're constantly stressing your bones. And you kind of think of that as like, as you're putting this weight on your bones, they have to remodel to get stronger to withhold that sort of that pressure that it's getting. And so because vegans tend to weigh less, and because, at least in some of the cohorts, there were potentially quite a number of vegans who would classify as underweight, they are actually at really high risk of fracture. So some of the important takeaways are make sure you're at least eating enough calories and enough protein and all of that to maintain your body weight. Make sure you're getting enough calcium and vitamin D, because in the Adventist Health Study too, when they looked at people who were supplementing with calcium and vitamin D, there was no increase in risk and fracture among vegans. So that's important as well. And then beyond nutrition, because that's a relatively small piece, I highly, highly recommend resistance training or some type of weight-bearing exercise. So that could be body weight exercises. It could be lifting weights in the gym. It could be running, even if we're talking about hip bone mineral density. These are the sorts of things that are going to have the largest impact on maintaining bone mineral density.
Yeah, speaking of lifting weights, you look a little more swole than the last time I saw you. You've been spending some time pumping iron.
I mean, I have for a long time, but I'd say I'm definitely moving up in the weight category a little bit.
Yeah, man. Look at you getting them vegan gains. Well done, sir. Yeah, Mary right now, speaking of strength training in the chat, was just kind of echoing what you were saying, reduce that risk of fracture by lifting weights, stressing your bones, getting calcium from like broccoli, kale, those healthy sources. But I like your idea also of, supplementing with the fortified plant-based milks. I mean, it's really kind of an easy thing to do. DJ in the chat, though, is wondering, and by the way, if you have a question for Dr. Nagra, you can post it in the comments or in the chat. We're going to open up the doctor's mailbag here in just a little bit. And DJ is wondering whether calcium tablets, if you're supplementing with it, aren't those kind of risky in terms of heart health?
Yeah, so there is some research linking calcium supplementation to higher risk of cardiovascular disease, but this appears to be at high doses in people who are already consuming enough or near enough. What I'm talking about here is supplementing, say, a modest dose of calcium, maybe 500-600 milligrams, maybe 1,000, even if you're somebody with a low calcium intake, to get you over that RDA of 1,000, or for postmenopausal women, 1,200. In those cases, there isn't any good evidence suggesting that it increases cardiovascular risk. So it seems specific to those high doses in people who are already pretty well getting enough.
And I've also heard, sticking with fractures for just a little bit, that another theory that's out there is far as why vegans are more prone to fractures, at least in some studies, is that, as you were saying, there's less body weight, and so the bones aren't being, they're not quite as strong if you're not doing that strength training. But one of the other theories that was posited was because they are on the leaner side, if they do happen to take a tumble, if they do fall, there's not anything really there that's going to cushion it. So it's just like bone on whatever the structure is, if it's the floor, if it's cement, whatever the case may be. Do you think that that's actually a theory worth exploring further?
I've seen that mentioned in some papers as like a speculation around a possible mechanism. I don't know if that's been like absolutely proven. I mean, it would make sense. But either way, it's possibly an issue. And on that note, falls is actually a major driver, of course, of fracture risk. And again, resistance training can reduce risk of falls later on. So that's just another benefit beyond just the bone strengthening benefits for resistance training.
You guys also looked at obviously chronic disease prevention, cancer risk in this paper. Kind of walk us through what it is that you discovered that might be kind of surprising, because obviously, we've talked ad nauseum on the show before about the benefits of eating a plant-based diet in terms of chronic disease reduction. But was there anything new in this research that you guys found that really stood out to you and said, wow, even that surprised me after all these years?
I wouldn't say there was anything super surprising, again, because this is something that we kept up with over the years. But something that was maybe more on the interesting side was the stroke findings. So you may recall from, I think it was 2019, maybe 2020, there were some headlines around vegans and vegetarians being at higher risk of stroke. But when you actually look at the totality of evidence and the meta-analyses where they pool a bunch of different studies together and look at stroke risk, there actually doesn't appear to be a clear risk of stroke. There was that one study, Epic Oxford, that did suggest so, but it was specifically in older people. And what they found was that there was a significantly lower risk of heart disease amongst the vegans and vegetarians, but a possible risk of stroke later on. And one of the possible reasons for that is that because the plant-based diets reduced risk of heart attack, which was more common, it led to them living longer to the point that strokes become more common. So it was one of these issues that's called a competing risk. If you lower risk of one thing, you're more likely to have something else happen down the road. So it's still like a net positive, if that makes sense. But that might explain why you saw more strokes in that population, but were far outweighed by the lower heart attack risk.
All right, so let's brass tacks this before we open up the doctor's mailbag, and let's talk directly to those group of individuals who are probably new to the idea of eating a plant-based diet or trying to figure out what is the healthiest diet for them. And they are a little bit concerned about, again, that stigmatizing term, carefully planning, careful consideration. What would your advice be to a patient who walks into your office for the first time and wants to start making some healthier steps? How do you coach them along so that they don't get overwhelmed in terms of having to carefully plan down the portion, and I need this much for that and that much for this, and just overwhelming, and you don't want their head to explode? How can you simplify this for somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I think over time we can refine it further and further and get more into the nitty gritty of the little details. But on the surface, you want to have, you want to focus on whole grains. So things like brown rice, quinoa, oats, whole wheat products over the refined like white flour, white rice, etc. So focus on those as sort of a base for a lot of your meals. Include vegetables at least once, maybe twice a day minimum. And then one of the biggest things that I think a lot of people in the plant-based community end up missing out on, especially if they are going the more like, say, super low fat or lower protein route, is I actually think there's a lot of benefit here to incorporating a protein-rich plant food as a centerpiece of at least a couple of your meals per day. So these are things like lentils, tofu, seitan, etc. Having that be sort of the centerpiece, just make sure you're getting a lot of good protein in. Those foods also tend to be rich in iron. They also tend to be rich in fiber. Tofu maybe a little bit less so because of it's been refined down a little bit, but especially a lot of the beans and whatnot. And then fruits and nuts as snacks are great options as well. That would help someone get sort of the base of what a healthy dietary pattern looks like. And then as far as additional supplementation, I mean, we discuss a lot of this in the paper if people want more detail, but by and large, I'd say it comes down to vitamin B12 for sure. You want a regular, reliable source of that. Plant-based milks for calcium, or perhaps consider a calcium supplement. And that's something that you could discuss with your healthcare provider to figure out like appropriate dosing for you, how much are you getting and all of that. Possibly vitamin D, again, depending on where you are. If you're somewhere with a lot of strong sun exposure, like down in California where I just was, or up here in Vancouver where you don't get much sun exposure, vitamin D supplement might become more important. Or really to cover a lot of bases, to cover those, plus to cover things like iodine, potentially zinc, which are other nutrients that there's a little bit of debate around. A simple multivitamin. That's actually personally what I do. I just take a simple vegan multi and it covers my bases and I don't have to think about it. I think that makes it super easy for people to have that peace of mind around the micronutrients, and then they can focus more on the overall diet quality. Again, those foods, the whole grains, fruits, veggies, legumes, nuts and seeds, versus having to overthink all of the like individual micronutrients that they might need to focus on.
All right, let's just have a practical conversation right now, because you're talking about multivitamins, and I think that people who are really ingrained in this community, vitamin supplementation outside of B12 and calcium. I mean, like, you're talking about a multivitamin and it's almost taboo for some people. It's like, you're just not doing the diet well enough if you're taking a multivitamin. I mean, to me, that kind of diet, personally, I can't speak on behalf of the organization here. It just seems ludicrous that we're arguing over a multivitamin, for goodness sakes. We got to do something to get rid of the stigma, dude.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you because, like, look, is it possible to have a multivitamin where they just dose the crap out of something that might end up being a negative? Sure. I haven't really seen that in practice. I've looked at a number of multivitamins. There are a lot of actually really cheap, well-formulated multivitamins out there, plant-based ones. And then, of course, there's some more expensive ones as well. But a lot of them cover anywhere from 50 to 100% of your RDA or DRI, rather, for individual nutrients. And that is really kind of what you want. The rest of your diet is going to be pretty easy for the most part. And so a modestly dosed multivitamin, I just don't see any risk to that. That would be my question. Is there risk? If so, where's the evidence for that? At those types of doses, there just really isn't. Now, is it going to improve your lifespan or something? I mean, there's research looking at mortality risk in multivitamins, and no, it doesn't really seem to have an impact, but that's not why people take multivitamins. You take a multivitamin so that you don't run into a deficiency of one of these micronutrients that otherwise could have been covered by a cheap, multivitamin. Like the one that I take, I think for a 3-month supply, it's like $20 or something. It's really not something that needs to be, I think, overthought.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also a lot of people kind of incorrectly assume that if they take a multivitamin and they're not eating a healthy diet, the multivitamin is automatically going to make them healthy. This is one of the things that I thought back in the day when I was overweight. Somehow taking a multivitamin made all those trips through the drive-through. It just offset them. Nothing, obviously, could be further from the truth, man. But we convince ourselves of the funniest daggone things, man.
Yeah, no, I would look at micronutrient intake and like diet quality as sort of separate camps. Obviously, there's overlap, but one, you want to make sure you're hitting your micronutrient needs, and then two, you want to make sure you're focusing on good quality foods like the ones that I mentioned earlier. Both of those are going to lead to a healthier overall life and hopefully a long and healthy life.
Yep. And yeah, if you have a question for Dr. Nagra, again, put it in the comment or in the chat. We're going to open up the doctor's mailbag. I keep saying that, but I promise you, we're going to do it here in just a second. And going back to the multivitamin thing, I think that also, if we clean up our diet and we eat a healthy way, like, are the gains coming from the fact that we're getting this influx of healthy nutrients from these foods, or does the benefit truly come, the greater benefit come because we're not ingesting Twinkies and hamburgers and, extra large double cheese, double pepperoni pizzas every day?
I'd say a bit of both. So if we're looking at diet quality, there are certain things in, say, let's look at red meat, for example. There's the saturated fat, there's the dietary cholesterol, there's the heme iron, Nu5GC. There's a bunch of compounds that might contribute to poorer health outcomes. And then you replace that with, say, legumes that have plenty of fiber. They're low in saturated fat. They have phytochemicals, and especially the darker ones are richer in those phytochemicals that all have positive impacts on like arterial health. It might have anti-cancer properties and so on. So you can move from one end of the spectrum that is less healthy to the far other end that is quite healthy, and you're going to see a rather large difference in health outcomes there. Now, there's a plenty of things in the middle. So, I often talk about, okay, you have processed meat, and then you have unprocessed red meat, and then you have like white meats, and then you have like over here maybe high fat dairy products, and you have low fat dairy products, and fish along with plant proteins. Like it's all on a spectrum. So it sort of depends on what you're replacing as far as like what compounds might be contributing to the overall benefit.
All right, let's go ahead now and finally open up that doctor's mailbag. We're going to start with Stephen Turner. Stephen is wondering, Dr. Nagra, is a small amount of a calcium supplement the same as having, say, tofu that has calcium added to it?
I like the Team Canada logo there. I just got to point that one out real
Stephen,
quick.
yeah,
Yeah,
repping the home team for you there,
yeah.
man.
um, so so tofu with calcium added. So if it's a calcium set tofu, that would be like taking a calcium supplement. Like in those cases, some of them will have a lot of calcium. Like you might, if you're eating a full block, end up with 600 milligrams plus. And if that's the case, then yeah, you're basically taking a supplement. I don't see a good reason to add to the top of that. But in order to say that with confidence, I'd have to review your whole diet and see, where's the other calcium coming from and so on. So that would give kind of a general answer, I'd say.
Is it best practice to always look for foods that have been fortified? I'm not talking about like ultra processed stuff that's been refined, like white bread, but like, do you want to look at orange juice that's had calcium and vitamin D added to it? Do you want to make sure that there's calcium in the tofu? Things like that.
So I would say generally, if given the options, then yes, I would choose that option that's fortified. I find it really funny. You'll see a lot of companies nowadays advertise, "Oh, my soy milk only has 4 ingredients and whatever." But in my view, they're just advertising an inferior product. They're advertising a product that doesn't have all of the B vitamins and the calcium and the vitamin D and all of that, which I want. So I do recommend looking for that. However, when it comes to tofu, I don't know what it's like in America, but here in Canada, I find it very hard to find calcium set tofu. So most of the tofu doesn't have the added calcium here. But if you have that option, I think that's a fantastic option.
And I'm a label reader. I have no idea whether or not the tofu that's in my fridge right now is fortified.
You'd have to look at the calcium content and see if it's like 300, 400, 500 milligrams in a package or more, then yeah, it probably is. But if it's like 50 or 100 milligrams, probably not.
All right. Vicky is wondering if you could name drop the vitamin brand that you use, if you're comfortable doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all affiliated, just to be clear, but I often use the Diva, DEVA. Just I find them cheap. They're transparent too. I had a friend reach out to them and ask for like their testing data and stuff, and they sent it on. And most supplement companies won't do that, so I thought that was good. There's another one like Platinum Naturals that I think is maybe a Canadian brand. Anyways, they're also widely available. I've used them before. I've used Complement. I've honestly kind of used a bunch of them. For me, it's I'm not too worried about using one specific brand or I'm not allegiant to any one particular brand. I just kind of use what's available to me. If I remember to order off a specific site, I'll do that. Or once in a while, a company not Diva, actually they should, but not but other companies have maybe sent me a product here or there, and I'll use it till it's done. So it's that sort of thing.
Diva. That's pretty funny. DEVA. I'll have to check them out.
Yeah.
I use a brand called Naturello, which is
I've seen them as well.
Yeah. Yep. But I like your price point a lot better than what I've been paying.
Yeah, Diva is one of the cheapest out there that I've seen, and like I said, they're like transparent with the testing and everything, and their dosing is quite good. So I do like them for that reason.
All right, Caesar, what do you think about intermittent fasting for vegans?
So I think intermittent fasting can be helpful for people looking to limit their intake of food. So if they are, overeating, if they are gaining weight, that's one way to help mitigate that. I haven't seen compelling evidence that intermittent fasting is uniquely beneficial. I know a lot of people argue about like autophagy and all these things. I haven't seen that translate into outcomes. At the end of the day, when you look at studies where people either intermittent fast or time restricted eat, where they'll eat between, I don't know, time of like 10 and 6 or whatever it is. When they do that, or when they spread food intake over the whole day, it doesn't make a difference if they're eating the same amount.
All right, let's take a question from Mr. Ribbit. That's pretty funny. Do either of you guys recommend taking a protein powder? I used to, but don't feel like I need it anymore. Got as big as I wanted eating just plants. Protein supplementation.
So I do. Most days, maybe not every day, but most days I do. It's not that I need it. I can actually hit quite a high protein intake without supplementing, but I find it to be a really convenient, really easy snack, on days like today where I'm at work and maybe I don't have a proper break, kind of using my break right now. But anyways, I find it to be really convenient. It can also help lower blood pressure, lower cholesterol. There's some studies supporting weight loss benefits as well for people who have those goals. So I think it's definitely a very convenient way to get more protein in if people want to, but like you suggested, you don't need to. And I want to be clear as well. most of the gains from lifting weights are going to come from, well, lifting weights. And of course, eating enough overall. The protein is secondary to that. It can further boost performance a little bit. And over time, especially over years, that can add up, but it's not going to make or break somebody's results, especially if they're more of a recreational athlete.
Right on. Good stuff. All right. Not so much a question, just a statement of fact. Vegan Linked. Dr. Nagra is awesome. Care to respond, sir?
I got nothing to say. Thank you.
All right. Karen, what lab should I ask my doctor for if I'm feeling a little bit weak? She says she's been eating a plant-based diet for 3 years, but recently began to feel a little weak in general.
Yeah, I mean, without, again, I don't know your history. There might be more specific tests to run, but generally speaking, when it comes to weakness or fatigue, things that people are going to want to look at are iron, or ferritin is what it's called on a blood test, vitamin B12, TSH, which is a marker of thyroid function. Those are some of the general ones, but I'm sure your doctor would run those. Those are very, very standard to run in these sorts of cases.
David, don't call me Winston Churchill. What is your favorite chain restaurant and healthy thing to order there?
Chain restaurant. See, all my favorite plant-based restaurants here in Vancouver, I feel like aren't really chain. I mean, there's some that have like a few branches, like Meat, MEET is actually the spelling of it. I think, did we go there when you were here? I can't remember. We might have.
No.
Maybe we did. Oh, maybe we
no.
didn't.
We
Okay.
did Planta.
Yeah, okay.
In Toronto, but no,
yeah, that was in Toronto.
Me.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, so that would be one of my favorites in town. Virtuous Pie as well, actually, which is like plant-based pizza, but like artisan style, and it's not like the heavy American style, like cheesy type thing.
That's where we went with Will Bolsewitz, right?
No, I thought, or yes, we did. I do remember that now. Yeah, so that place, there's a few branches of that, but none of these are like huge chain restaurants. I think if I was to pick one that's more widespread, maybe like a Chipotle or something, just because you can make a burrito bowl, you can load it up with veggies and beans, and like you can actually make it a pretty healthy meal when on the go. But I wouldn't say I do that super often these days.
All right. Let's see. I want to ask you about going to Japan, but first, Andrea, what is your favorite protein powder? So which one do you recommend? Name drop if you feel, so inclined. If not, whatever.
I sort of like the multivitamins. I feel like I use a bunch of different kinds. There's the Phyta, our buddy James Wilkes has that company. It's super, super good. Mixes well with coffee. So I like doing that combination. There's V-Gain, which is a Vancouver Island based company, which is actually where I'm from. And so definitely supportive of them. And they have a new product called Surge, which is like sort of like an electrolyte mix powder, except you mix it with, and it's rich in protein, and you mix it with water, and it's kind of like drinking a juice, but it's loaded with protein, which is really interesting. There's Good Protein, which is sort of like a meal replacement, so kind of in between a protein powder and a multi or a meal replacement. Sorry, I don't know that I have I don't really have a specific one that I use. I jump around, and there's others as well. Sometimes I'll just go to the supplement shop and I'll see if there's anything interesting or new or it's on sale or something, and just try it out. So can't say I have one specific favorite.
All right, I want to sneak one more question in before we take that trip to the land of the rising sun. DJ just hit me. I think that this is a really important one. I'm working on a better heart health diet. I'm already plant-based. Do you have some top recommendations for preventing heart disease?
I mean, it depends on what the risk factors are. So, I mean, one of the primary risk factors is going to be high cholesterol or ApoB. And in those cases, some of the foods that are best for that are things with viscous fiber. So you think of that sort of gooey or sticky fiber that you'll get when you like cook oats or when you have eggplant or okra. That's really good for lowering these markers, ApoB and cholesterol. There's also polyunsaturated fat. So from nuts and seeds, especially, or even from some liquid vegetable oils, those can help lower cholesterol numbers. But it really depends on what risk factors we're talking about here. Again, I don't really know your situation. So I usually suggest in these cases to work with a dietitian who is experienced with plant-based nutrition, so they can sort of navigate your dietary preferences and hopefully advise you on how you can implement more of these types of foods that will ultimately improve your heart health.
All right. And to Richard right now, who's wanting to throw a little bit of shade out there, are we going to cite any papers? First of all, that's cite with a C, but that's okay. That's a story for another day. There is a link in the show description to the paper. And that
we got 67 references in there, just in case anyone's wondering.
Exactly. So Yeah. So if you're looking for that information, Richard, go ahead and click on that. And that goes for literally anybody else who's joining us today, whether you're listening to the podcast on Apple or Spotify or watching us here on YouTube and Facebook. That link is down below for you. Before I let you go, man, let's talk about your trip over to Japan recently, because you, correct me if I'm wrong, were very surprised at, the different food options that were over there and just how vastly different they are to what's available here to us in North America. What did you notice?
Yeah, I mean, I was going over there for vacation, but certainly knew that like obesity rates, for example, are extremely low there if you use the same criteria that we use in North America. So if you were to use the same BMI cutoffs, the obesity rate's like 5%, 4 or 5%, something like that. Whereas here it's 40, or in America it's 42% or somewhere in that ballpark. So a huge difference. And I was really taking note of just how different the food system is. So for example, you go into a 7-Eleven or a convenience store, you have ready-made meals with like beans and vegetables in the fridge that you can just pick up and go. They have frozen fruit in these cups that you just take up to the front, pay for it, and then they throw it in a machine that adds water and blends it up, and you have a fresh smoothie. And it's just like super quick and easy. And then even if you look at like say potato chips or something, which they do have as well, the bags are like this big. Like they're tiny bags relative to what you would get over here. At the same time, we definitely wanted to try out the vegan food scene, and we went to a couple like bakeries and things like that. And again, the serving sizes, you get a piece of cake, it's like that big, not maybe even smaller than that. And it's just obviously there's a huge cultural difference in the way that they eat and how much they eat. But it just really highlighted how much our food system here works against us. I think what we ultimately need to really combat a lot of the problems that we have with our nutrition is an overall food system like rejigging or overhaul, like we saw in the North Korea project. Are you familiar with that? Because I think that's a really interesting thing to touch on a little bit.
No, by all means, enlighten us.
Okay. Yeah. So the North Korea project was, this was done in Finland. They had some of the highest coronary heart disease rates in the world. I can't remember exactly when this was. Maybe it was 50 years ago or somewhere like that. They had some of the highest coronary heart disease rates in the world. And they had an overall, like a very coordinated food system and just overall public health campaign. And so they had advertisements on like the risks of smoking that were going out everywhere. They had similar sort of education around nutrition. They actually had restaurants and food manufacturers replace the salt in food with salt alternatives so that they still tasted salty, but they were low in sodium. They lowered the saturated fat content of a lot of the foods, replacing them with plant-based fats or unsaturated fats. And they dropped cholesterol levels by a massive margin and lowered coronary heart disease rates by like 80, or I think it was 83%. Over the course of, it was a number of years. I can't recall if it was like 10 years or the exact timeline, but that was arguably the most successful public health campaign ever when it comes to nutrition and other lifestyle factors like smoking as well. So that's the type of thing that we need, I think, to really make a meaningful difference. And just going to Japan and seeing how they're obviously in better health than us over here, and how their food system is so different, I think really just shed some light on that.
That is fascinating to me. And, I want to bring up another point that you mentioned to me before we started air, is that if we use the same guidelines or parameters to qualify obesity in Japan as we do here, the rate of obesity in Japan is astonishingly low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Isn't
extremely low. Yeah, it's like 5%.
Golly gee. What do they use different parameters over there to qualify it?
Yeah, so their cutoffs are lower. So if you have a BMI, I think I have to double check. So a BMI of 25 here is considered overweight, and then 30 would be obesity. There, the cutoff for overweight, I believe, is 23. And then I can't recall what number was obesity, but they're all lower. And a part of that is that in Asians and South Asians, actually, like my background, we tend to place more fat in and around our organs, especially in our liver. And so we run into health problems at lower body weights than Caucasians generally do. And so that's one reason that the cutoffs are lower, because you kind of need to be lower to avoid those risks.
I did not know that. That's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to me. Man.
Yeah.
Could you ever see North America like adopting those same type of guidelines where we are a little bit more stringent about things, regardless of, how our bodies process the fat or where we store the fat? I mean, could you ever see us getting to a place where we drop those totals even lower? I mean, we did that with blood pressure. We lowered those guidelines. Why can't we do the same thing for BMI?
So actually, there's now an argument. There has been a push for dropping BMI altogether as a criteria because BMI isn't perfect. It's kind of a gross estimate of the amount of weight to your height, and it can be high in, say, people with a lot of muscle mass, but they aren't necessarily ill or don't necessarily have complications of obesity because they have a lot of muscle. They just happen to have a lot of muscle. There's also cases where, like with elderly, they might have a low BMI, but actually have what's called sarcopenic obesity because they don't have any muscle really, and it's a lot of fat, but they just don't weigh a ton. And so now they're looking at different stages of obesity where you basically qualify it on the basis of, do you have complications that would be attributable to metabolic dysfunction or obesity? So do you have fatty liver? Do you have high blood sugar? Looking at those markers rather than looking at the BMI, because the BMI just on a population level is pretty good. I guess, on average, people with a high BMI are going to be, having these complications. But on an individual basis, there could be a lot of variability there. Like, funny enough, even myself, I'm at the high end of what would be considered normal. Even though I'd say I'm pretty far off from dealing with those complications of obesity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, like before I got sick and my metabolism went wonky, even when I was at 140, I was still technically overweight for my height, which I thought was astonishing. And you factor in the fact that I never had my skin removed after, having such dramatic weight loss that, estimate maybe 10, 15 pounds of skin. That obviously would have dropped me right down into that normal range. But, I've known for a long time BMI is not exactly the best guideline for determining whether or not somebody is technically obese or overweight. But I think that without that, it's going to be really hard on an individual level to diagnose, like how many people actually know whether or not they have fatty liver disease. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there'd certainly be testing there. And actually, one of the markers that would be better than even a BMI would be like waist circumference or waist to hip ratio. Like, so there's these things that you can also measure for free at home. Mind you, there's a little bit of skill involved with measuring those. But those are things that would be maybe more predictive than just BMI as well. Either way, I mean, this is something that is hotly debated, I feel, and there's just recently some guidelines coming out around it. So we'll have to see how that sort of shakes out in the coming years here.
All right, man. Well, let's wrap things up, go back to the beginning, and just kind of rehash what your beautifully written paper is all about. Careful planning with your diet. Recap this for us, man.
I would say that all dietary patterns, if the goal is to eat a well-rounded diet that covers your nutritional needs and that supports long-term health, it requires careful planning, whether that includes some animal products or none at all. This is not something to apply solely to plant-based diets. Yes, there are certain nutrients like vitamin B12, like potentially vitamin D or calcium, that do require some attention on a plant-based diet, but there are other nutrients like fiber and polyunsaturated fats that require some attention on an omnivorous diet. Let's just all carefully plan, quote unquote, our diets to make sure that we cover our basic needs. And actually, to go a little bit further, it's not like it requires a ton of attention, just a little bit. And you can easily cover most of those bases with a simple multivitamin or something of the like.
Dr. Matthew Nagra, man, I appreciate you taking the time. Again, a link to the paper, the research is down below. You said 67 citations in there?
That one, yes.
Nice. Well done. Also a link to his website there, and absolutely a must follow on the Instagram. You see it down below under his name, dr.matthewnagra on the Instagram. He is the debater extraordinaire of data. My man does it like nobody else. A+ follow every day. I appreciate you taking the time, man.
Thanks for having me again.
All right. And on behalf of everybody here at the Physicians Committee, I am Chuck Carroll. Thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, keep it plant-based.